point. Every human being is made up of two things, right? There is the physical side of the human being, and there's the unseen, or the spiritual side of the human being, right? Every human being has this. We have the body, and we have the soul. Now, there are certain things that the body needs to become strong. There are certain things that the body needs to sustain life. Everybody with me? What are those things? Food, water, air, right? These are things we need to stay alive physically. But the soul also has things that it needs to stay alive. And what happens in Ramadan is that we are, in a sense, starving the body but feeding the soul. We are not eating, we are not giving food to the body, but we are giving food to the soul. And this is so important because most of our lives is spent feeding the body, let's be honest, right? Most of our lives we focus on the needs of our physical needs, the needs of our physical self, right? I feel hungry, I gotta eat, right? I feel cold, I gotta, warm myself up. I'm thirsty, I drink. I have a desire, I fulfill it. We tend to focus a lot of our efforts on fulfilling the physical needs. But many of us neglect the spiritual needs. Many of us neglect the needs of our heart and the needs of our soul. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes, and out of His mercy, He makes it required for us to feed our soul in Ramadan. You see? Allah is requiring us to feed our soul through fasting. And this is one of the mercies of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's allowing us to put aside, it's like, imagine that you're in a battlefield for a second, right? And you have all these enemies coming at you, right? You're trying to win. And you have all these enemies coming at you. Imagine you have all these different armies. Now, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is doing for us in Ramadan is He's tying up some of these armies to allow us to be successful. What are these enemies? What are these armies? Well, first of all, we know we have this thing called a nafs, right? What's a nafs? Our own self. Now, our own self has a lower part. In other words, the lower desires, the animalistic side of the human being. That's the nafs, okay? We have a lower self, the lower desires, which is the nafs. Now, this nafs, the lower part of the nafs, or a nafs al-ammara, this is a side of the human that pulls the human being towards things which are more animalistic. Follow your desires, regardless of whether it's right or wrong. Now we have the nafs, and that's one enemy. And by the way, the nafs is one of the hardest enemies to fight. Because it's you. It's within you. Many people ask this question, how do I know if a whisper is from my nafs or from shaitan? Right? Well, essentially it's not necessarily relevant. The point is that if it's wrong, it's wrong. But one way you'll know is that the whisper of shaitan can come from any angle. Shaitan wants us to disobey Allah from any door. Really, he doesn't really care as long as we disobey Allah. And usually what shaitan does is he uses the nafs to get to us, if that makes sense. I'll explain what I mean. The nafs is my own weaknesses. And every individual has their own weaknesses, right? Certain people have a weakness in this department, others have a weakness in that department, right? So what will happen is shaitan will use your weakness against you. And sometimes you'll find that there's certain whispers or certain sins that we become addicted to. That's the nafs, right? It's not just like shaitan can come at you with any sin, but the nafs has certain attachments and certain weaknesses. That's me, that's myself. And this is an enemy I have to fight. That's the whole concept of tazkiyah. Tazkiyah is to purify. And tazkiyah to nafs is to work to purify that lower self. Because within every human being is kind of like this untamed beast. And if you don't tame it, and you just feed it, it becomes a monster, right? And we see this throughout the world. What happens to a human being when they don't tame the monster inside. I mean, the kind of carnage that the human being can cause is unbelievable. And that's because the human has the potential to be a monster. If that nafs is not tamed and just fed. Do you understand what I mean? You can become, you know, we can become like the shayateen. We can become like the devils if that nafs is not tamed, right? So this enemy is very serious. But we have another enemy, which is the external enemy. I've just spoken about the internal enemy, right? We have another enemy, which is the external enemy, and that is Shaitan and his army, right? Now, Shaitan and his army are always at us, as they promise, as Shaitan promised, I will come at you, I will come at your believing slaves from their front and from their back. And notice that Shaitan, when he promised to do this, he said, I will attack them on your straight path. Do you know what that means? It means that it's the people who are trying so hard to stay on the straight path that the shayateen want to attack more, right? Because they're the ones you have to work harder to get. So he's saying, I will attack them on your straight path. And he says that I will come at them from their front and from their back, from their right and from their left. Meaning that Shaitan and his army are going to come from every direction that they possibly can to try to take us off the straight path. So here we are in this battle of life, right? With all these enemies, yeah? We have the internal enemy, that's me. And we have the external enemy, which is Shaitan and his army. So what does Allah do in Ramadan? Allah, in his mercy, ties up one of the enemies. And that's what? The Prophet ﷺ said that when Ramadan enters, the doors of paradise are open, the doors of hellfire are closed, and the shayateen are tied up. Allah has eliminated one of the major enemies, and that is Shaitan and his army. You feel me? So what's left? The nafs. The nafs. That's me. That's my internal enemy. That part in me that can become a monster if it's not tamed, right? The selfish part. The part that hungers for power, right? You know what I'm talking about? We see that in many of our leaders, what that can look like. What that can look like when it's not tamed. That greed, that's all nafs. That's the nafs. And so we have this left. So what does Ramadan do? Well, it ties up the external enemy and now empowers us against the internal enemy. It empowers us against our nafs. How? Through fasting. When we fast, we are suppressing the nafs. When we fast, we are taming the nafs. Because the nafs is saying, eat, drink, intimacy. That's what the nafs is saying. That's part of the lower desires. That's the lower self. We have a lower self, the physical, and we have a higher self, the spiritual. It's the lower self that's saying eat, drink, intimacy. And we are taming that through fasting. We are taming that through extra ibadah, through extra worship. And in that way, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is allowing us to win this battle.